So in this short seminar, I will talk to you about the potential of AI and Earth observation to support urban sustainability in Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly their capabilities of filling a lot of digital data gaps that are very prominent in the region. So I will take you through a trip of my own experience in the past years as a researcher, and concluding to what is happening right now when it comes to the potential of AI to help in filling these gaps, and also some future prospects, which is also a part of why I am a digital futures fellow here at the KTH, and what I will be focusing on in the next couple of years. But before that, I go into the technical details or the applications. It's important to set up some proper context on why this is needed, what kind of data gaps we're talking about, and how are all of these affecting people. So from a geographical perspective, Sub-Saharan Africa has been and will be undergoing severe and dramatic urbanization, much more than other regions of the world. We can, as you can see on the graph quickly, that the projections up to 2150, Africa will be having an almost linear population growth, while other regions of the world are completely plateaued or are expected to reach a plateau like in Asia. This causes a lot of issues, as most of this population growth is absorbed by cities. There is a huge growth in cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, which with respect causes the expansion of slum regions or deprived urban areas. It is noted that we could have more than 1.2 billion urban dwellers by 2050, and there are more than 4.5 million new residents in informal settlements each year, and a big part of them in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this, in relation to the extreme urbanization that African cities are undergoing, for example, not accompanied by industrial growth that is typically occurred in other regions, has really dramatically shaped and transformed these cities. And quickly here we can see what do I mean about that, this rapid growth of the cities. We have Ouagadougou in 2002, then just 8 years later, we have seen a complete transformation of and expansion of the built-up areas, and also the type of these built-up areas. We can see from unregulated, unplanned slum region, it has kind of been upgraded. So there is rapid change. And the cities are becoming more and more complex to monitor. We need a lot of data for these cities. For example, 90% of the global population increase, as we talked about it before, will happen in low and middle income countries and their cities, and mostly in deprived urban areas. These deprived regions are absorbing most of the population growth. So when we talk about sustainability and what we can do to support this phenomenon and like treat them and improve the well-being of urban residents, most people think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly when we're talking about cities and the well-being of urban residents, Goal 11, which proposes the need to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, which has also concrete targets. So by the end of 2030, to ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services, upgrading the slums, and of course, enhancing inclusiveness, citizen participation, and sustainable urbanization. But in order to help monitor and achieve and help address these targets of the SDGs, we need a lot of data. And most of this data, to me at least, should be relevant for the people that need them the most, which is the people living on slums or deprived urban areas, depending on the terminology. So a slum household, as defined by the UN Habitat, is lacking either durable housing, sufficient space, safe water, or adequate sanitation, or security of tenure, any of these factors, or a combination of these factors. And also it is a part of the SDGs itself as the proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements. So it's one of the indicators. The problem is that the data for these indicators are very often incomplete, inconsistent, or countries do not completely report or they underreport for political reasons what is happening in the slums, for example, the population, their socioeconomic conditions, epidemiological status, which is really problematic because these are the areas that most of the vulnerable population lives. So we need the best or at least adequate information in these regions. So when we're talking about data availability, we can quickly think of what is the main source of data for these situations. It could be the census. And on the figure on the right, we see the last year that the census happened in Africa, in African countries, across African countries. And there are some regions where we have relatively new census, but there's a lot of countries that haven't had the census for more than 10 or 15 years. And in some regions, it goes beyond 18, we're back in the 80s again. So there is a dramatic need for good information in these regions, and Earth observation and AI can play a really important role to fill these gaps. So why Earth observation and AI, particularly remote sensing, can be a key component to fill in these information gaps, because it can provide documentation and description over very fine geographical scales, at very fine spatial resolutions. It is operational as it's constantly monitoring the Earth's surface, so we can acquire images over images if we want to. And also it connects very well, as you all very well know, with computer vision and AI and machine learning. The combination of this data coming from satellite images and AI is very, very synergistic and with a huge potential. And moreover, and very importantly, I would say, we can map both biophysical and socioeconomic phenomena through the combination of AI and Earth observation. So by biophysical, I mean, we can map the land cover, and by socioeconomic, I mean, we can actually try to measure the wealth of people from space, to a degree, of course. So for me, the fundamental, let's say, tenets of performing any sort of analysis in the global south is to acquire land cover and land use. For these are the two pillars that through them we can traverse to different, more complicated phenomena like epidemiological or poverty related or hazard related. We need to understand, first of all, the physical signature of the ground of a city, and also its use by people. So here we see on the left a very high resolution land cover, and on the right we see the same region in terms of land use at the street block level. And by land use, we mean the type of neighborhood or the density of the neighborhood, what are very important for characterizing urban populations and urban morphology. Typically in many of these regions, we don't even have land parcels available. So we need to create even the street blocks ourselves. A common approach that we do is that we have an automated process that downloads OSM data, all the linear elements of OSM, and it constructs automatically street blocks from that database. And from there, we combine the street blocks, the OSM street blocks, with a land cover, and we can go further into the land use, which we can quickly identify where we have informal neighborhoods, where we have formal ones, and their density, as they're, in terms of morphology of urban characteristics, they are very different from each other when it comes to density or the distribution of the different patterns, their height, their elevation, their vegetation patterns. So that's a first step, and this could happen with very different resolutions. We can go from a very high resolution one, which is albeit quite expensive to acquire, to low-cost solutions like Spot, for example, and of course free of charge with very high temporal resolution, Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 images. So with all of them, we can do pretty good work when it comes to that, but of course the level of detail can vary. The thing is that with even with Sentinel images, for example, this map is produced with Sentinel imagery, Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, we can acquire very potent land use maps, we can identify where the deprived areas are in a city. This is Nairobi. And also we can acquire even more further and more sophisticated knowledge when it comes to what types of deprived neighborhoods. We can here, for example, have a map of the probability of a neighborhood to be a slum. And of course, you can see it really converges with what is mapped as a deprived urban area. And this is happening with a combination of AI, of course, machine learning techniques that extract image features, either through convolutional networks or through more standard feature extraction. They both work quite well to do these tasks. And these tasks are very helpful to do. For example, here we see the urban divide in Khartoum in Sudan within 30 years, how the urban growth is kind of, let's say, limiting the accessibility. A big part of the city is expanding on the left, but the accessibility center is on the right. So we can see this urban divide and we can really measure it quite efficiently. Another very important potential when we map the urban surface like that is mapping waste, garbage. Garbage is a big problem in these cities, and I've been working a bit with my colleagues in Nairobi, where waste disposal is a huge issue. It is often deposited across the river. So we have floodings, we have a spark of infectious diseases that is caused by this depositing of waste, mostly in the slum regions or deprived urban areas. So it is quite an issue, but also it is quite evident from the light. What we do is we map waste piles, as you can see there with purple color here. I think this is the upper figure shows that, and you can see how the waste pile is deposited across the river. And then we can extract gridded indicators of the density of waste piles, which can be used for by stakeholders or by government authorities, as we are in collaboration with them to quickly identify the hotspots of waste disposal and help them build a better plan of accumulating and distributing waste across the slums of Nairobi, or in general the city of Nairobi. And this is Malaria, one of the slums of the city. Also, when it comes to other facets like climate change, we see here in Lagos that the most vulnerable population, the slum region, is really living on the areas most likely to flood, let's say in the bottom of the city, while the residents on the more wealthier, more affluent regions are in higher elevations, which affects also other things like malaria, like epidemiology, like vector-borne diseases. So the location, also the physical characteristics have a very strong connection with the socioeconomic outcomes. Also, when we talk about urban heat islands, again, deprived urban areas and slums have it way worse. They are the hotspots usually of an urban heat island effect. So, as I mentioned a bit, vector-borne diseases and epidemiological risk, I would like to talk a bit about malaria, which is a big issue in Africa. Most of the impact it has is in Sub-Saharan Africa, as it causes more than 400,000 deaths a year. Most of them are children below 5 years old, and most of them are in Sub-Saharan Africa. So usually, and until a few decades ago, malaria was predominantly a rural issue. It wasn't such a big thing in the cities, but now with this massive urbanization and even further urbanization that is projected in the future, malaria is becoming has a very strong urban aspect. And this has to do with urban agriculture that is increasing, as malaria is a vector-borne disease transmitted by mosquitoes who transmit the parasite to humans. So the vectors, the mosquitoes, breed in small puddles of water. So when we have urban agriculture or industrial areas that are not really paid attention to, they are full of water when it's flooding, and then the mosquito breeding really intensifies, which also affects the transmission of malaria in general. So Earth observation, again, and AI, machine learning can help us detect hotspots of malaria, but also understand the factors behind it. Here we have some models that use land cover and land use information that I showed to you before at a very high resolution. And we couple them with machine learning algorithms and a very few malaria surveys to map malaria risk in figures A and C across two cities, Kampala and Dar es Salaam. And we can see that there is a very strong connection with what we have mapped, for example, the slums, the informal residential areas, or agricultural areas, wetlands, irrigated lands. There is a very intrinsic connection between what we see from space, from a satellite image, what we map, and its effect on epidemiological outcomes like the risk of malaria, which was quite fascinating to see that it is possible to do and to build models like that at that fine resolution. This is a grid of 100 meters resolution. And this is in Kampala. The previous was in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. This is Kampala, Uganda. Again, the same thing. We can see that the risk of malaria, the malaria prevalence is really higher in where we have the slums, the informal residential areas, where we have agricultural areas, while when we have the, for example, the next to the informal residential area on figure D, it is a very affluent, wealthy neighborhood, but is built on top of a hill. It's like this is an elevated area. You can see that the risk there is very low, around 2 or 3%. So there is a huge socioeconomic aspect when it comes to malaria and epidemiological diseases, and a part of it, not all of it, of course, not even half of it sometimes, but we can map it from space. And this is, again, I would say, reflects what the social processes in a city, the socioeconomic processes in a city are reflected by the urban morphology, to a degree at least, which is quite interesting. Another type of model is measuring wealth using, again, satellite-derived data and some few surveys. So here we mapped wealth, household wealth in Dakar at very fine resolutions, again, using land use and land cover data. And we could extract very interpretable relationships. We could see, for example, that if we map the swimming pools, it's figure F on the third row, and on the y-axis we have the wealth index. There is a very strong relationship between the proportion of swimming pools in a neighborhood and its association with the wealth index, a very strong positive association. Or when we have high elevated buildings, which indicates perhaps more affluent neighborhoods or more commercial centers. Or when we have a large proportion of slums, you can see how the wealth index really bottoms out immediately after a certain threshold is passed. Which again is very interesting, given that these surveys are very sparse, they're with a very small sample size, but still the connections we can make from ground to space using machine learning. These models are non-linear, I think, random forest models optimized through spatial simulations, are very, very good. And this is for some of the maps on the figure on the left, the first figure, we see some of the census data. And then we have other various machine learning models predicted. And we see that more or less general patterns are very frequent, are very co-occurring. And the correlation is over 50, correlation coefficient of 0.60 to 70 sometimes. So very good correlations for the most part. So all of these things that I talked to, I believe I have how much more time? Okay, I have a few more minutes. All of these things that I mentioned need one underlying component that is very important, the most important, the population, the denominator. We need to know the people that are exposed to these events. We need to know the people that are exposed to malaria, the people that are exposed to toxic waste, the people that are exposed to these natural hazards, the people that are living in slums. Finding the number of people is very important and equally difficult and challenging in this data scarce context. And population information are very important. Again, we see they are required for a vast array of epidemiological, for example, topics, malaria, dengue, Lassa fever. We need to know how to allocate resources, vaccines, how hospitals should be built. And if we don't have a denominator, the number of people, all of these otherwise simple computations become very, very challenging. So we need to know how many people there are, where are they, who are these people, how do they move around, and traditional census, as we talked, as I explained before, are either very outdated, or they're at very coarse resolutions, or there is a mismatch between one date and the other, completely different administrative units, so you can't really even merge them. It is very challenging to work with outdated census data, even if you have some. So then again, AI and Earth observation comes into play and help a lot on this. There is usually two approaches that we can model and map population at fine resolutions using geospatial data, either bottom up or top down. The most common ones that we know, the most popular products in terms of coverage and temporal resolution as well are top down, which means we are disaggregating administrative units, some existing census data, but we know the population, to very fine scales using geospatial information that are at finer resolution. So the principle is called asymmetric redistribution, asymmetric mapping. If we assume that, for example, the area on figure A, we know the population, we know the number of people there, but we want to put these people into a finer resolution, a finer spatial grid. What we do is we use ancillary features. This is from, for example, it could be a land cover map on figure B that says that only these two areas, the dark shaped areas, are cities and everything else is water. Then we know that that these people are not living on the water, obviously. So we know we put them there. So we immediately get a very fine resolution, much finer at least from what we had to start with. And this is how these products operate. There are quite a few continental or global sized products. They are coming, more of them every year. The most common of them are the World Pop, the Landscan. There's a few others as well, the GHSL, and their available resolution varies a lot. They can go from 5 kilometers to 100 meters, and they also have different coverage when it comes to dates from the 90s to 2050. They are all nice in the sense that they can be used for continental analysis or national analysis, but when you use them over the cities, they're really not well performing. We need something else there. We need something like this. And this can, so far, was extracted from processing high resolution remote sensing and using high resolution land covers and land use. It requires some more information, which these products do not have. I can give you an example here. This is one region in Dakar, and this is the World Pop products, one of the most common at 100-meter resolution. So there is some, some pattern, but if you want to use this for intra-urban analysis, if you only work at the city level, this is very constraining. So what we need is something like this, but this took me about 2 years to complete because I needed to have a very high resolution land cover, a very high resolution land use, and put them together and do the symmetric distribution. But this is a product at 10 meter. Now it's been used for COVID, let's say, estimates there. But this is what we need in urban regions now, in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have these products in a lot of Western countries already, but we need them at a very good resolution there as well. So the other approach is bottom up, is kind of the opposite. We have some small training data, some small areas that could be micro censuses or micro population counts, and then we build a machine learning model or geostatistical model using, again, geospatial covariates, and we extrapolate across a larger grid. So it's kind of, you don't need census data for that, but you need to have micro census data, which can be quite expensive or difficult to acquire. So there's a trade-off there on what you can do. But the transformation, what is happening now in the field, is the building footprints. Both Microsoft, Google, and Maxar are in the game of building footprints at continental or global scales. So we see here there is a bias again in when it comes to building footprints. This is a Microsoft ones, but when we overlay them over deprived urban areas, over slums, you see that they don't even capture half of them. So when you use them, for example, for population purposes in these regions, you are really, really far off the grid. In some cases, other ones are better. This is, for example, the Google building footprints, which are usually quite more robust. They also have uncertainty estimates, and this is the ones I would prefer using so far. But then again, there are issues with them. There are some regions that they also are incomplete and problematic, but they're still better off. The problem with this, there's both a problem and a potential. If these building footprints would be almost fully accurate, they are tremendously helping the issue of population mapping in these areas, and mostly in deprived urban areas, and we need the population. Especially if we assume that, if we know, for example, that in Kenya, in Nairobi, 60% of the city's inhabitants live in deprived urban areas, but in terms of space, geographical space, they take 4% of the built-up area. So the density there is extreme, both the population and the building density. But the global population models that I was talking about sometimes cover less than 10% of the population. You see that if you use the Maxar, let's say, building footprints, on the map here we see the building density, or the buildings per hectare. We overlay them, these products, over a fully 100% dense slum, and you will see there is some polygons with like 10% building density. What is this, helping to distribute population there? So accounting that we can do something about this, we can help these models get better, or we can provide additional information. So even when these models are bad, we can take the appropriate information we need for population extraction from other ones, like, for example, a layer of slum probabilities. Then we can really push the science ahead. So deep learning is a very strong tool, but it's not very widely used so far for population mapping. It has very limited application and almost no applications for urban studies. So this is what I will be working the next 2 years here, to use deep learning, some more refined CNNs and their combination and potential by using a lot of ancillary variables to improve both the top-down methods at an intra-urban scale and also the bottom-up ones. So the idea is to use both VHR images, but also Sentinel 1 and 2 when possible, and explore transfer learning. We're really kind of on the edge of the field here. Everyone is on this right now. Facebook, Google, the large products like Wallpop, they are all into using deep learning now because of the very, very important, strong generalization capabilities it has for extracting image information. So in essence, to bridge these data gaps, the major challenges are scalability, the integration of well-thought AI methods, and their potential for being transferable. But of course, there are other things like understanding the local context. We can't just bring a method of the AI field because it's good and just apply it immediately. We need to understand where we're applying it, why we're applying it, under which context. Is it responding to information needs? Is it helping people? Is it clearly validated? I'm sorry, my PowerPoint is just rushing ahead by itself. Is it ethical from a privacy perspective? Is it communable to the EO products and their users? So there is a lot of efforts to kind of build this deprivation aspect and standardize it. One of it is the idea maps, the integrated deprived area mapping network, which kind of take all of these aspects and puts them at the geographic scale. So you're very welcome to check what has been done there, kind of formalizes the whole concept, sorry. And also the focus in geography is very important. Most of the research is happening on secondary cities, sorry, in primary cities, but where it should mostly happen is secondary cities. We have very limited knowledge on what is happening in these areas. They have very high degrees of inequalities. They are going to be the mega centers of tomorrow. They are absorbing most of the rural to urban migration, while primary cities have already kind of stabilized when it comes to their growth. But still, of the little research that is happening in Global South, most of it is happening in primary cities. So we need to have a shift to use AI, population models and poverty models and slab mapping models and Earth observation in these secondary cities, as it has been recommended recently in the World Urban Forum by the UN Habitat. So we have a mandate to do so. And finally, we need to be careful with the geoethical implications of such work. When we're talking about socioeconomic parameters, health outcomes, we are beyond just mapping vegetation or building footprints. We can have a very strong impact on people's lives. And this is, as Professor Richard Sluice says from ITC, whatever puts people on the map can also take them off the map. So we need to be very careful when we disseminate these products, that they are being used in support of the most vulnerable, not for the opposite. And labeling an area as deprived, for example, when it is an output of a classification algorithm, can have an impact. Is it especially is it a false positive? Is it a false negative? If we have an error, what is better? What is most preferred? So there is a lot of implications, of geoethical implications behind that we need to account for, we need to consider, and this is essentially a new field now with the rapid emergence of AI and the things it can do. Also, the ethical implications have really, we have a lot more ethical implications that we need to account for in a proper manner. And when it comes to the privacy, one of these ethical considerations, when we ask the people there, when we ask the locals through surveys, they of course are in favor of gridded products. So that's one way to deal with some of the privacy concerns, as it kind of fuzzes out the potential for pinpointing individuals and their locations. But of course, this is just a small facet of all of the potential geoethical implications. I'm just bringing this as an example. So to finalize this, there's some nice links that you are very welcome to check. Probably will help you understand a bit more of what I'm talking about. And some closing thoughts on combining community-based data with EO and AI to democratize the access to this data, to document and make them understandable so they can be used by the locals, and they also will be more motivated to help us collect data, and of course to support fair data exchange in all of these matters. Thank you very much, and I think this is the end of my presentation.